The train's whistle cut through the dry wind like a blade, its echo vanishing into the flat expanse of prairie beyond. Clara sat stiffly on the worn bench of the third-class car, her hands clenched around a tattered envelope. On it, the name Silas R. Boone was written in bold script. Her husband, by paper and vow, but not yet by heart. She had traveled over 2,000 miles west, answering the advertisement of a rancher in need of a wife. A mail-order bride, they called it, as if love were something that could be packed and shipped. But Clara hadn't come for romance. She came to survive. Back in Ohio, her family's farm had withered, like everything else touched by illness and war. By 23, she had buried both parents and 2 younger siblings. All that remained was the ring on her finger, cold and unfamiliar, sent in a box along with a single train ticket and a brief letter. My house is small but clean. I expect a woman who can work, cook, and keep quiet. If you're soft or given to fancy ideas, don't bother coming. She had come anyway. As the train screeched to a stop at Black Hollow Station, Clara stepped off into the ochre dust, her skirt brushing the gravel. No one waited on the platform with flowers or smiles. Only a tall man with sun-damaged skin and a sour mouth stood leaning against a buckboard wagon. "Clara?" he asked, not kindly. She nodded. "Yes, sir." "Get in." No welcome, no warmth. The ride to the ranch was silent, except for the jostling of wheels and the occasional grunt from the horses. Clara tried not to shrink beneath Silas Boone's glare. His eyes were sharp, judging every inch of her. She wasn't pretty in the doll-like way men often wanted. Her shoulders were strong, her hands rough from milking and tilling. But her spirit hadn't broken yet. Not entirely. When they reached the ranch, if it could be called that, she saw a broken fence, one limping cow, and a cabin barely standing upright. Silas tossed her bag onto the porch and said, "This is it. You cook, you clean, and you don't argue. You understand me?" "Yes, sir," she said again. It wasn't understanding. It was surrender, for now. That night, Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the back room, listening to the wind push against the shutters. Silas hadn't spoken another word. He hadn't asked about her journey. He hadn't asked about her past. He only drank from a dented flask and stared at the fire. And when he finally went to sleep in the other room, alone, Clara released the breath she'd been holding since she arrived. Outside, the stars blinked coldly overhead, and in the shadows beyond the cabin, someone else watched. A man fixing a broken fence line on the neighboring property, his lantern glowing faint in the dark. His name was Luke Merritt. He didn't know it yet, but the woman who'd just arrived would change everything he thought he'd lost. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of silence, labor, and aching solitude. Clara rose with the sun, her hands blistering from mending the neglected chicken coop and scrubbing years of grime off cast-iron pans. Silas gave no thanks. He left at dawn on his horse and returned at dusk, smelling of tobacco and dust, grumbling about dry fields and lazy cattle. He barely looked at her. Each evening, Clara sat at the edge of the porch with a tin cup of lukewarm water, staring out at the distant hills where gold met gray. And always, without fail, there was a flicker of light across the neighboring field, a small lantern swaying gently near the fence line. She saw it again one evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the prairie. "That's Luke Merritt's land," Silas muttered behind her, watching where her eyes lingered. "He fixes fences this late?" she asked quietly. "That man had fixed the moon if he thought it'd bring rain. Don't look his way." He turned and spat into the dust. That was the most Silas had said to her in 3 days. On the other side of that fence, Luke Merritt tugged at a stubborn post, his calloused hands working without rest. He wasn't mending wood just for the sake of it. He'd seen Clara on the porch, frail, quiet, yet proud, her back straight despite her husband's disdain. Luke knew Boone's reputation. Most folks did. He drank mean, worked hard, and loved no one. And now, he had a wife brought in like cattle. "She doesn't belong in that house," Luke murmured to himself, eyes narrowing in the dim light. But he knew better than to interfere with another man's household. That was the code of the frontier, even when the code protected cruelty. Clara, meanwhile, found solace in stolen moments. In the early morning, when the prairie was wrapped in fog, she would sit behind the barn with a small journal, a gift from her sister long ago. She wrote without purpose, without even names, just fragments. "The dust in his boots never settles. The fire never warms, but the wind, it listens." She never intended for anyone to read it. But one day, when Silas had gone to town for supplies, Clara wandered to the edge of the property. She didn't mean to cross the fence, but her feet kept moving. Just past the thicket of dry reeds and leaning barbed wire stood a broken wagon wheel, sun-bleached and quiet. There, kneeling beside it, was Luke. He looked up, surprised but not unkindly. "You're on the wrong side," he said gently. "Maybe I am," Clara replied. They didn't speak again that day. Clara turned and walked back to the cabin, her chest tight with guilt and something she couldn't name. But something had shifted in that brief exchange. A crack in the stone that was slowly becoming a window. And Luke, alone beside that wheel, watched her disappear into the tall grass, his heart heavier than it had been in years. He didn't know it yet, but the moment would stay with him, just as it would with her. The next morning, a harsh knock woke Clara before the rooster crowed. She pulled on her shawl and opened the cabin door to find Silas already saddling the horse, his expression hard. "I'm heading to the county line. Don't wait up." "Will you be gone overnight?" she asked, voice careful. He didn't answer, just mounted the horse and rode off in a cloud of dust. Clara stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. For the first time since her arrival, the air around the house felt still, not safe, not warm, but still, as if the wind had paused to see what she'd do next. She turned and went back inside, her heart echoing with a strange mixture of relief and unease. By midday, the sky turned a heavy shade of copper. The air was dry, the land quiet, and Clara found herself standing by the back fence, hands gripping the rough wood as she watched the horizon. And then she saw him. Luke Merritt was across the field, kneeling by a trough on his property, feeding 2 calves. He wore no coat, just a simple work shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing strong forearms browned by sun. Clara thought to turn away. She should. But something held her there. As if he felt it, Luke looked up. Their eyes met across the tall grass. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But there was something in his expression that made Clara feel seen. Not owned, not judged, just seen. Later that day, as she scrubbed the floorboards of the cabin, Clara heard a knock on the door. Not the angry pounding of Silas, a gentle knock. She opened it cautiously. Luke stood there holding a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "Brought some bread and dried apples," he said. "Figured you might not have much with Boone gone." Clara stared at the bundle, unsure whether to take it. "He wouldn't like it," she whispered. Luke nodded. "I'll leave it on the step then. You don't have to say anything." As he turned to leave, she found her voice. "Thank you for not asking questions. Everyone deserves kindness," he said, his voice quiet, even when they think they don't. Then he walked away, leaving the bundle on the porch and a ripple of warmth behind him. That night, Clara sat by the fire, slowly chewing the slice of bread he'd given her. It wasn't just food. It was a reminder that someone nearby saw her as a person, that not all men were like Silas. She picked up her journal and wrote a single line. "Kindness speaks louder when whispered." And outside, across the prairie, a man repaired another fence post under the fading stars, thinking of the woman who finally looked back. The next days were quiet. Silas returned late that first evening, drunk, with dirt on his coat and ash on his breath. He said nothing to Clara, just collapsed into bed and snored like thunder through the night. He didn't ask where the bread came from, and she didn't offer. But each morning, she watched Luke's silhouette across the fields, always tending, always working, always silent. He never came back to the cabin. But one afternoon, as she was hanging damp linens, she found a small jar of honey resting on the porch railing, with a sprig of wildflowers tied to it with twine. Clara's hands trembled as she touched the glass. She hadn't tasted honey in years. The bruises from her first week had started to fade, though they still ached deep inside. She hadn't cried since arriving. Not once. But that night, as she sipped the sweet gold Luke left her, tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She didn't sob. She didn't weep. She just let them fall, like rain breaking a long drought. 2 days later, Clara stepped beyond the yard for the first time since arriving. Silas was gone again, off to a distant saloon, she guessed, and her feet carried her toward the open fields. Not toward Luke's home, but close. She paused by a large oak near the edge of the property, one she'd seen from the window. It offered a rare patch of shade. She sat beneath it, letting the wind run through her hair for the first time in months. She heard a cough behind her. Luke. He stood a few paces back, a bundle of fence wire in his arms. "Didn't mean to disturb," he said. "You didn't," she answered softly. They stood in silence for a long while. "Why do you help me?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because someone once helped me when I didn't think I was worth saving." She looked at him then, not as a stranger, not as a neighbor, but as a man who carried quiet grief like she did, who worked through his pain instead of speaking it. "What happened to you?" she asked. Luke's eyes clouded. "My wife died. 2 years ago. Childbirth. Took both of them." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara didn't speak. She simply reached out and placed a hand gently on his sleeve. For a moment, neither moved. Then Luke tipped his hat and turned away. "Take the shade as long as you like," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Merritt." "It's Luke," he said over his shoulder before walking away. That night, Clara opened her journal again. She wrote, "He gave me honey, but what I tasted was grace." And far across the grasslands, Luke stared at the stars, whispering to the memory of his lost wife, "I think I found someone who knows what silence feels like." Autumn crept across the prairie, quiet and golden. Each morning, Clara would rise early, light the stove, and sweep the porch before Silas stumbled out to bark orders or vanish into town. Sometimes he wouldn't return until long after dark. She never asked where he went. She just prayed the time alone might stretch a little longer. And it did. She began spending her afternoons by the oak tree at the edge of their land, just far enough to be out of sight from the house, yet not so far that it would raise suspicion. That patch of grass, that tree, they became hers, her sanctuary. And often Luke Merritt would be there. Not always to speak. He didn't seem to be a man who needed many words, but to mend a fence, to fix a gate, to pass by and tip his hat. Sometimes he'd bring her something simple, an apple, a clean handkerchief, once even a small book of poetry worn soft with use. Clara read it by lamplight and smiled more than once. One afternoon, Clara dared to ask, "Why do you stay here on this land after what happened?" Luke looked up from where he was repairing a post. "Because it's the only place that still feels like home," he said. "Even if the people I loved are gone, the memories, they linger in the soil." She understood, more than he knew. They started talking more often, cautiously at first. They never mentioned Silas, not even once. But there was an unspoken awareness between them that danger wasn't far behind. Clara could see it in Luke's eyes every time he noticed a bruise on her wrist, or when she winced while bending too fast. He never asked what happened. He didn't need to. One day, Clara brought a bundle of wildflowers to lay beneath the tree. She told him it reminded her of her mother's garden back in Tennessee. "What happened to your family?" Luke asked quietly. She hesitated, then spoke. "I lost them in a fever. All of them. Mama, Papa, 2 younger brothers. The doctor said it was typhoid. I left with nothing but a satchel and a name someone gave me for a man needing a wife." "Silas," Luke said, his voice tightening. She nodded. "I thought even a cruel home might be better than no home at all." Luke said nothing for a long moment. Then his voice barely above a whisper. "No one should ever have to choose between cruelty and emptiness." That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Clara turned to leave, but Luke stopped her with a single question. "Would you stay if you had another choice?" Her heart caught in her throat. She didn't answer, but he didn't need her to, because in the way her eyes glistened and lingered, just for a heartbeat longer than they should, it was answer enough. That night, Clara wrote, "He never touched me, but somehow, he's the only man who's made me feel safe." The days shortened. Shadows grew longer. Yet somehow, Clara found a light she hadn't known she was missing. Luke had become the quiet rhythm of her afternoons, a steady presence like the wind through the wheat fields. They never made promises, never dared to dream aloud, but every small gesture between them was a whisper of what could be, if the world were kinder. One crisp morning, Luke came riding down the path with something wrapped in a canvas cloth. "What's that?" Clara asked, brushing hair from her brow as she looked up from the wash basin. "Something I fixed up," Luke replied. "Thought you might like it." He unwrapped the bundle. It was a battered violin. The strings were newly tightened, the bow repaired with care. The wood still bore the scars of age, but it had clearly once been beautiful, and still was in a quiet way. Clara blinked in disbelief. "How did you know I played?" Luke smiled faintly. "Heard you humming once. It sounded like music waiting to be born." She cradled the violin like something sacred. That evening, beneath the oak tree, Clara played for the first time in years. The notes were shy at first, stumbling, awkward, but then they found each other. Soft, aching melodies spilled through the grass, curling into the dusky sky like smoke. Luke didn't say a word. He just sat there, hat in hand, eyes never leaving her. When the last note faded, Clara looked up, and for the first time since she arrived in Montana, she smiled. Really smiled. It caught even her by surprise, a rush of something warm and dangerous blooming in her chest. But joy, when you're not used to it, Feels fragile, like it might break if you hold it too tightly. She whispered, it doesn't feel real." Luke leaned against the tree beside her. "Maybe that's how you know it is." The next day, she found a wooden bench under the oak tree. New. Handmade. He didn't sign it or say a word. But she knew. Luke had carved her name beneath it. Clara. No title, no shame, no mark of ownership. Just her name, as if that alone was enough. And for once it was. That night, as she stood at the stove, Silas burst in, drunk and scowling. His boots dragged dust across the floor she'd just scrubbed. He didn't notice the faint scent of fiddlewood still clinging to her dress, or the smile she quickly tucked away. "Where's supper?" he growled. "On the stove," Clara answered quietly. He muttered, poured himself a cup of whiskey, and didn't speak another word. But as Clara served his food, a new strength settled in her bones. Because somewhere beyond that door was a man who gave her a violin. Not chains. A man who carved her name into something meant to last. And that was more than she'd ever thought she'd have. The quiet between Clara and Silas grew heavier with each passing day. Once she had feared his presence. Now, it was the silence that unsettled her more. He watched her from the shadows of their small cabin, eyes dulled by whiskey, yet sharpened by suspicion. Something in her had changed, and he knew it. One evening after supper, Silas slammed his tin cup onto the table. "Where do you go every afternoon?" Clara didn't flinch. She kept her hands folded neatly on her lap. "To the river, to think." "You're thinking too much lately," he growled, voice low and bitter. "Thinking don't suit you." She didn't respond. Silence had become her armor. "You're up to something," he spat. "You think I don't see it? I see everything." She stood slowly, her face calm. "Then you'd see I'm not afraid of you anymore." It was the first time she'd ever said it, and it cut deeper than a knife. The next day, Clara returned from the riverside to find the violin shattered on the porch. Broken strings hung like veins from the splintered wood. She stared at it, hands trembling. Not from sadness, but from something fiercer. Not just grief, not just anger. Resolve. She walked straight to Luke's ranch the next morning. Dust clung to her hem, and sorrow clung to her ribs. But she didn't stop. Luke saw her coming. He dropped his tools and met her halfway, his brow furrowed with concern. She didn't speak at first. She just held out the broken violin. He smashed it. Luke's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Did he touch you?" Clara shook her head. "Not yet." Luke nodded, then said quietly, "Then we fix it before he does." They spent the afternoon repairing what they could. But some things don't go back together the same. When Clara tried to play again, the notes were out of tune. Her fingers shook. She looked away in shame, but Luke placed his hand over hers. "You don't need to play, you just need to stay." Those 6 words clung to her the rest of the day. That night, Clara didn't go back. Silas stormed into the ranch the next morning shouting her name, demanding her return. Luke met him at the door, taller, stronger, sober. "She's not your property." "She's my wife." "No, she was a deal you made, not a promise you kept." Silas lunged, but Luke didn't flinch. "If you ever come near her again, I won't call the sheriff." He said it so softly it made Silas pause. For the first time, Clara saw fear in her husband's eyes, not from the threat, but from the truth of it. He turned and left. Clara stood behind the barn wall, heart thundering. She'd always thought safety was a place. Now she knew it was a person, and she'd finally found him. The wind carried a gentler song across the plains the next morning. For the first time in months, Clara woke to something unfamiliar. Peace. She lay beneath a borrowed quilt in Luke's spare room. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. She heard the soft thump of boots outside her door, then a quiet knock. "Morning," Luke's voice said. "There's coffee and eggs, if you're hungry." Clara opened the door, eyes tired but steady. "I'm more than hungry," she smiled. "I'm ready." They ate in silence, but it was the kind of silence that comforted. Luke didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He didn't need her past to understand her pain. After breakfast, he handed her a folded scarf. "You'll need this. It gets colder out by the northern fence." "Am I working now?" she asked, one brow lifted. "No," he said, a flicker of a smile. "You're healing." The days that followed passed in a rhythm she didn't know she craved. Mornings feeding the chickens, afternoons tending the garden, evenings by the fire with quiet talk and the crackle of kindling. Clara laughed again for the first time, genuine and bright, when she found herself wrestling a stubborn goat who refused to stay penned. Luke watched from the distance, arms crossed, a smile tugging at the edges of his lips. "Told you he was trouble," he said when she returned, hair tangled, cheeks red. "So was I," she replied. "But someone gave me a second chance." Their eyes met and held. One evening, while sorting supplies in the barn, Clara found an old saddle tucked in a corner. She ran her fingers across the worn leather and turned to Luke. "Whose was this?" "My wife's," he said quietly. "She used to ride every morning." Clara's expression softened. "You don't talk about her much, because I thought if I said her name, I'd break." He looked away. "But you've shown me that broken things can still be mended." That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Clara sat beside Luke on the porch. No words were needed. The silence was different now, shared, not empty. Luke handed her a new violin case. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a finely crafted instrument. Not expensive, but made with care. "It's yours," he said. "Why?" "Because someone like you should never be silenced." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. And then she played. Soft, sweet, steady notes drifted through the night. And the prairie, the past, and even her own pain listened. The melody Clara played that night didn't just fill the air. It filled Luke's home. Her bow slid gently across the strings, drawing out a tune as tender as her healing heart. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Luke stood quietly beside the doorway, arms folded, watching the woman who had once collapsed on his land now bring it to life again. He didn't speak until the final note faded into the stillness. "I never knew music could mend a place like that." Clara set the violin down with reverence. "It doesn't mend places," she whispered. "It mends people." Over the next weeks, Clara's presence became a rhythm in Luke's life. Not a disruption, not a rescue, just a steady return to something forgotten. The ranch responded to her too. Animals calmed around her. The gardens thrived under her hands. Even the kitchen, which Luke once avoided, now smelled of cornbread and roasted herbs. But every healing journey has shadows. One morning, while Luke was in town for supplies, Clara spotted a stranger on horseback pausing at the edge of the property. The man wore a long coat and held his hat low, obscuring his features. When he saw her, he turned his horse and rode off without a word. That night, Clara didn't sleep. Her hands trembled as she held her cup of tea by the fire. Luke noticed. "Something happened while I was out?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A rider, watching from the ridge." "Could you see his face?" "No, but I felt something, like I knew him." Luke's eyes narrowed. He'd seen that look before, when prey remembered its predator. The next morning, Luke saddled his horse and rode the ridge himself. He found nothing, no tracks, no prints. But that only made his gut twist harder. Back at the ranch, Clara stood by the gate, gripping the post like it was her only anchor. "If he comes back, I won't run," she said before he spoke. Luke dismounted, dust trailing from his coat. "You shouldn't have to fight anymore." "Maybe not," she said, "but I will." He admired her courage, but worried how deep her wounds truly went. That night, Clara placed the violin back in its case and locked it. "Why?" Luke asked. "Until I know what he wants, I can't play. Not yet." Luke reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "Whatever storm comes, you're not facing it alone." Her eyes welled with silent gratitude. Because for the first time in her life, someone wasn't saving her. He was standing with her. The air grew tense in the following days. Clara tried to return to the rhythm she had built, feeding chickens, tending the garden, mending Luke's shirts with quiet care. But there was a tremble beneath her every motion, like a string pulled too tight. Luke saw it. He didn't press her with questions, but every time she stepped outside, his eyes followed. His rifle rested a little closer to the door now. And the old stallion in the barn, once meant for long-distance rides, was kept saddled. Then it happened, late one evening, just as the sun began to vanish behind the hills. Hooves thundered down the slope toward the ranch. Luke met them with his shotgun across his arms, Clara behind him on the porch, her breath caught in her chest. The man dismounted slowly. Long coat, dusty boots, a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Clara," he said, "took me long enough to find you." She stepped down behind Luke, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "Warren." Luke didn't lower the gun. "Friend of yours?" Warren laughed low. "Husband, actually. Or was. We never did sign those papers, did we?" The silence was cold. Clara stepped out from behind Luke. "You left me tied to a post, starving. You were too wild, too proud. I thought a little time in the cold would fix that." Luke's grip on the shotgun tightened, but Clara touched his arm gently. "I don't need him hurt," she said. "I need him gone." Warren chuckled, stepping closer. "You think this man can protect you? I gave you a name, girl. You owe me." "I don't owe you anything," she said, standing taller. "You gave me chains. He gave me peace." Warren's expression shifted, a flicker of rage rising. But Luke stepped forward, voice steady and deep. "You have two choices. Turn around now or find out how hard I defend what's mine." Warren looked between them, his eyes calculating. Then, with a scoff and a spit on the ground, he turned back toward his horse. "She ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. Not anymore. When he disappeared over the hill, Clara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Luke still stood firm, his hand steady. Clara walked to him slowly and leaned her head against his chest. "You didn't save me," she whispered. "No? You gave me the space to save myself." That night, the violin came back out. And this time, when Clara played, the music wasn't searching. It was celebrating. After Warren's departure, the weight on Clara's shoulders began to lift, not all at once, but gradually, like morning fog burning off beneath the rising sun. She moved through the ranch with new purpose, no longer looking over her shoulder. Luke noticed the difference too. Her posture was straighter, her laughter lighter. She began humming as she worked. Tunes Luke didn't recognize but learned to love. One morning, as Clara trimmed the lavender by the porch, Luke approached her with a leather-bound book in hand. "Been thinking," he said. "I know you've lived under someone else's name for too long. Maybe it's time you had your own again." He opened the book and showed her the deed freshly amended, her name printed alongside his. Her breath caught. "You put my name on the ranch? You didn't ask for it. That's why you deserved it." Clara didn't answer. Instead, she reached for his hand, held it tight, and for a long moment, said nothing, because some gifts were too deep for words. That spring, something else bloomed. Clara planted a garden of her own. Her design, her soil, lettuce, carrots, herbs, a row of bright yellow flowers down the fence line. Every visitor that passed through the valley noticed it. It was the only place around with color like that. People started calling it Clara's Ridge. Luke never said much, but every time he walked by, he slowed. Sometimes he'd pause just to watch her among the petals and stalks. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the sunset flaring gold across the land, Clara turned to him. "Why do you keep this place, Luke? Why here?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because it's where I lost everything, and where I started finding it again." She nodded, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then let's make it home for real together." He looked down at her and, for the first time since his wife's passing, smiled without sadness behind his eyes. The days that followed were stitched together with quiet joys, small things that wouldn't mean much to anyone else but meant the world to Luke and Clara. They worked side by side in the barn, she mending bridles, he tightening hinges. At mealtimes they sat at the same table, sometimes in silence, sometimes swapping stories of childhood and prairie dreams. In those silences, a gentle rhythm formed, not of absence, but of comfort. A shared understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The ranch, once weathered with grief, was now humming with life. One afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning. The sky turned charcoal gray and thunder cracked like rifle fire. Clara rushed to close the shutters, but the wind caught one of them and knocked her back. Luke was there in an instant, arms around her, steadying her. For a moment, as lightning flickered across the room, they stayed like that, close, breathless. Her hand found his chest, and she felt his heartbeat, steady and strong beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "I'm all right," she whispered. "I know," he replied, softer than the storm outside. And yet he didn't let go. That night, with rain tapping against the roof, Clara couldn't sleep. She found herself walking the hall, barefoot, wrapped in a quilt. She stopped outside Luke's door, not to knock, just to listen. She could hear the slow creak of his chair, the sound of his pen scratching against paper. "You writing again?" she asked softly, stepping into the doorway. Luke looked up, surprised but not startled. "Just thoughts," he said. "Memories, I guess." "Mind if I sit?" He shook his head and moved over, making space for her beside the oil lamp. For a while, they just listened to the rain. Then Clara spoke. "I used to think I'd never feel safe again, but now, I do." He looked at her, eyes unreadable in the dim light. "It's not just safety," he said. "It's something deeper." She met his gaze. "Then let's name it. Let's stop hiding from it." That night, they didn't need declarations or grand gestures, just a shared moment under storm-lit skies, where two wounded hearts began to admit they were no longer just surviving. They were healing together. The morning after the storm, the world outside shimmered with a soft, silver dew. Clara stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, her eyes drifting to the mountains in the distance. Everything smelled of wet earth and renewal. She didn't hear Luke approach until he placed a folded wool blanket over her shoulders. "You always take care of everyone," she said with a smile. "Even when you're the one who needs care." Luke looked out at the quiet fields. "That's just what ranchers do. Fix what's broken, feed what's hungry." Clara tilted her head. "Even hearts?" His eyes flicked to hers. "Especially hearts." That day they worked on fencing near the south pasture. The rails had rotted from seasons of neglect. Clara's hands were blistered, and her braid was half unraveled by noon, but she kept up with Luke's pace. He noticed, not just her strength, but her steadiness, her refusal to give up. When they sat down for lunch under the cottonwoods, Clara opened her canteen and took a long drink, then passed it to him. "You built all this," she said, gesturing to the ranch. "And now you're rebuilding me too, aren't you?" Luke didn't answer at first. He just looked at her with something deeper than admiration, something that felt like home. "You weren't broken," he finally said. "You were abandoned. There's a difference." That night, as they sat beside the fire in the living room, Clara unfolded a small piece of paper from her apron pocket. It was the letter she'd carried from the mail order agency, her rejection from the man who left her in the wilderness. She stared at the ink for a long time before holding it over the flames. The paper curled and blackened. Luke didn't ask what it said. Instead, he said, "That man never saw your worth." Clara looked at him. "And you do?" He didn't answer with words this time. He reached over, took her hand in his, and gently placed it over his heart. That night, in the silence of the prairie, Clara finally felt something she hadn't in years. Wanted, chosen, home. The days began to stretch like golden thread, each one woven tighter between Clara and Luke. She had found a rhythm in ranch life, a rhythm she hadn't known her soul needed. She rose with the sun, her hands learning the language of the land, the quiet discipline of caring for something greater than herself. And always, always there was Luke, sometimes in the way he handed her gloves before she could ask, sometimes in how he mended the saddle she favored, sometimes in silence where his presence was enough to speak volumes. One afternoon, as they rode into town for supplies, Clara caught the stares of others. Whispers flitted behind hands, and someone muttered, "That's her, the mail-order girl who got left in the canyon." Clara's spine stiffened. But Luke, beside her, only reached down and took her hand. He didn't care who watched, and in that one small act, he erased their judgment. "Let 'em talk," he said. "The only thing that matters is you're standing here, with me." At the general store, Clara saw a bolt of deep green fabric, the exact shade of pine needles after rain. Without hesitation, Luke asked the shopkeeper to cut 3 yards. "For what?" Clara asked as they left. Luke smirked. "You'll see." That night, he brought her to the barn. Not for chores, for something else. A candlelit table stood where hay usually did. Beside it, a sewing kit, and the green fabric folded neatly. "I heard you say once you used to make dresses," he said, a little shy. "Thought maybe you'd want to make one for yourself." Her throat tightened. No one had remembered something so small and turned it into something so meaningful. "Luke," she whispered. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he pulled out a chair for her. Dinner was simple. Stew, warm bread, and apples from his tree. But Clara had never tasted anything more tender. Not because of the spices, but because of the way he watched her. As if she were something delicate that he had no intention of letting break again. Later, as she stitched the first seam of that green dress under the soft barn lights, Clara realized something. This wasn't survival anymore. It was healing. It was hope. It was the beginning of something real, something she never expected to find on the back end of betrayal. The green fabric slowly took shape in Clara's hands, each stitch a quiet act of restoration. She hadn't sewn in months, not since she left her parents' home. Yet muscle memory returned like an old friend, guiding her fingers in steady rhythm. Luke checked in on her every evening as she worked, often just leaning against the doorway of the barn, arms crossed, watching her with a look she was beginning to understand. Not desire, not pity, respect, admiration, and something deeper she dared not name yet. By the time the dress was finished, the pine trees were dusted with the first hint of snow. Clara stepped out of her small room wearing it one evening after supper, hands trembling slightly at her sides. Luke looked up from where he was brushing down one of the horses and froze. The dress hugged her gently, modest yet graceful. The color made her eyes look brighter, her skin warmer. But more than that, it was her, confident, whole. "You made that?" he asked softly, voice caught between awe and reverence. She nodded. "For myself, for tonight." "What's tonight?" "You'll see," she echoed his old line. She took his hand, led him to the barn, where lanterns already hung, and the small battery-powered radio Luke had salvaged crackled to life with the strains of a slow, gentle waltz. They danced, awkward at first. Luke's boots too big, Clara's steps too cautious. But soon the silence wrapped around them like the night sky, and their movements found rhythm. 1 step, 2 steps, a pause. Clara's head rested against his shoulder. "Why'd you fix up the barn like this?" he asked after a while. "Because no one's ever given me something that felt like mine. Until you did. This is my way of saying thank you." Luke stopped dancing. "Clara," he said, voice gravelly, "you're not something to be grateful for. You're someone I've been praying to find." Her breath caught. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. "I'm not perfect. I came broken." "So did I," he said. "But we're not broken now. We're just different. And maybe that's enough." That night, Luke didn't kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and led her back to the porch, where they sat under a blanket, watching the stars in silence. And when Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, she knew, without a doubt, that this was what safety felt like. Not a house, not a name, not a promise made in haste, but a man who chose her again and again in the quiet moments. The first real snowfall arrived with a gentle hush that blanketed the ranch in white. Clara awoke to the muffled sound of hooves outside, the air inside the small cabin colder than usual. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Luke was out front chopping wood. "You'll catch cold," she called softly. "Used to worse," he replied with a grin, wiping sweat from his brow. "Cold doesn't bite so hard when someone's waiting for you inside." She smiled, but there was something behind her eyes, something stirring. That afternoon they sat by the fire. Luke handed her a cup of strong coffee. Clara sipped, grateful for the warmth and for his presence. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. "Anything." She stared into the flames. "Back in town, before you brought me here, you looked like you hadn't smiled in years, like you carried the weight of a world I couldn't see. What happened to her, Luke? Your first wife?" The question hung between them. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he did. "Her name was Rose," he began slowly. "We met when we were barely more than kids, built everything together. This ranch, a life, a dream." Clara listened, motionless. "She died in childbirth. Took our son with her. I buried them up near the North Ridge, under a tree that still blooms early every spring. After that, I just stopped feeling anything." He stared into his mug. "Then I saw you. Not just at the auction, but how you looked at those kids, those strangers, like they were already yours. And I thought maybe, just maybe, there's life after grief." Clara reached out, laid her hand over his. "I wasn't looking for love," she said. "I was looking for freedom. But with you, I found both." They sat like that for a while, hand in hand, the wind howling softly beyond the wooden walls. That night, Luke didn't return to the barn after supper. Instead, he stayed by the fire with Clara, sharing stories in quiet voices, memories long buried, dreams once dismissed. She spoke of her brothers, scattered across states, of nights alone on a stranger's floor, of her refusal to be small, even when the world tried to make her disappear. He listened, really listened, as though each word was sacred. And when she finally rested her head on his shoulder again, he whispered the words neither of them had dared say out loud until now. "I want to build something with you, not just fix what's broken." Outside, the snow continued falling. But inside the cabin, two people were beginning again, not from nothing, but from honesty, from healing, from hope. The next morning brought more than snow. It brought smoke. Clara woke to the smell of something burning, sharp, thick, unmistakable. She bolted upright just as Luke flung open the cabin door, his face pale. "The barn's on fire!" Clara grabbed coats and ran after him, heart hammering. Outside, the barn was engulfed in orange and black, flames licking toward the winter sky. Luke didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the barn. "The horses!" he shouted. "And the feed!" Clara stopped at the fence, coughing from the smoke, watching Luke disappear into the blaze. Time slowed. Shouts from the children echoed across the yard. Then he emerged, pulling one of the horses by its halter, coughing and stumbling. He turned back for the second. "Luke, no! That beam!" But it was too late. The roof caved in, a thunderous crash of timber and sparks. Clara screamed his name. Moments passed like hours. Then movement. A figure burst through the smoke, half dragging a second horse, soot-covered, eyes red from smoke. It was Luke. He collapsed just before reaching the fence. The town's doctor, Doc Wilkes, came later that day, summoned by a neighbor who saw the fire from the ridge. Clara hovered as he checked Luke's lungs, bandaged a scorched hand, and scolded him for recklessness. "Could have been worse," Doc muttered. "But you'll live," Luke croaked. "Barn didn't." "Barn can be rebuilt," Clara whispered, kneeling beside him, brushing soot from his brow. "But you can't, you hear me?" He gave her a weary smile. "You're more worried about me than the barn?" "Damn right I am." They both laughed, breathless. And then, without thinking, Clara leaned down and kissed his cheek. Later, as the sun began to set over the charred remains, Clara stood with the children, comforting them, showing them strength she never knew she had. "We'll rebuild," she told them, "stronger, together." That night, Luke lay in bed, awake but quiet. Clara brought him warm tea and tucked the blanket higher over his chest. "You ran into fire for animals," she said. "They're part of the family." She nodded, then hesitated. "Would you do the same for me?" He turned his head, looked into her eyes. No hesitation. Without question. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clara wept. Not out of fear or grief, but because someone had finally made her feel safe. Outside, the embers of the barn cooled, but inside, something far more powerful burned between them. Trust, forged in fire. The next few days moved slowly, like the snowflakes that drifted across the burnt patch where the barn used to stand. But within the silence of that charred space, something new began to take root. Luke was confined to bed, his breathing still raspy, his hand tightly bandaged. Yet he never complained. Not about the pain, not about the loss. And Clara? She became his shadow. Without hesitation, she managed the ranch. She organized the children into chores, taught the youngest how to gather eggs and the oldest how to fix the broken chicken coop. She chopped wood, hauled water, made soup thick with potatoes and quiet affection. One night, while feeding the horses in the half-rebuilt lean-to, the eldest daughter, Meg, spoke softly behind her. "You're not just helping us anymore." Clara turned. "What do you mean?" "You're leading us, like Pa used to do before Ma got sick." There was no bitterness in her voice, just truth. That evening, Clara read to the children around the fire. Luke watched from the bed, propped up by pillows, a slow smile creeping across his face as he listened to her voice. Low, even, warm. He wasn't used to this kind of quiet. Not the lonely kind, but the gentle one. The kind that wraps around you like a quilt. When the children had gone to bed, Clara remained by the hearth, staring into the orange glow. Luke cleared his throat. "You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to save me," she answered. "That was different." "No, Luke," she said gently. "It's the same." They locked eyes. And in that moment, neither of them moved. The space between them was fragile, weighted with words unsaid, scars unseen, hearts learning to speak in silence. Clara broke it first. "You gave me a place to heal. I never knew what a home really was before this ranch." Luke looked down at his bandaged hand. "And I forgot what home felt like. Until you made it warm again." Clara blinked back tears. "Then maybe we're both healing." He reached out, slow, unsure, and brushed her fingers with his. "Maybe we are." No vows. No grand gestures. Just a wounded man and a once-abandoned woman, quietly stitching their lives together with the threads of resilience, kindness, and a fire that neither of them dared name yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering ash, softening pain, whispering promise. Tomorrow they'd begin rebuilding again, but tonight they simply sat in the hush of something sacred. The winds howled through the valley that night, rattling shutters and whistling through the cracks in the wooden frame of the house. A late winter storm had crept in without warning, turning the quiet prairie into a frigid battlefield of ice and wind. Clara was up early, wrapping the youngest children in blankets and boiling oats over the fire. Luke tried to rise from bed, but the moment he swung his legs over the edge, a sharp pain reminded him he was still healing. Clara appeared in the doorway. "Don't even think about it." He gave her a weak smile. "Hard to feel like a man when I can't even fetch a log." "You've done more than enough," she replied. "Let us carry it for a while." The storm picked up, and the day grew darker. Trees bowed under the weight of ice, and the river froze at its edges. Clara sent the older kids to tend the animals while she reinforced the barn roof with old canvas and prayer. Just before dusk, a loud crack echoed from the distance. They all froze. It came again, closer this time. Clara pulled a coat on over her apron and reached for the rifle above the door. Luke's voice was stern. "Don't go out there alone." But Clara only nodded to Meg, who was already bundling the little ones into the back room. Clara stepped out into the blowing snow. Shapes moved through the white. 2 men on horseback, cloaks pulled tight. They rode toward the house without hurry, but something in their posture made Clara grip the rifle tighter. "What do you want?" she called over the wind. The lead man pulled back his hood, a familiar face. Jed Harlan, the neighbor to the south, gruff, unpredictable, and not known for kindness. "Heard about the fire," he said. "Thought I'd come check if the place needed a new owner." Clara didn't blink. "We're not selling," Jed smiled with cold teeth. "Maybe not yet, but storms have a way of breaking people." From inside the house came the cock of a second rifle. Luke, leaning on the doorframe, pale but standing. You want this land, you better bring more than a storm. Jed looked between them, then spat into the snow. Suit yourselves, don't say I didn't offer help. He turned his horse and vanished into the white. That night, Clara lit an extra lantern and set it in the window. Not out of fear, but as a signal. This ranch wasn't alone anymore. Luke leaned against her shoulder as the fire cracked. You didn't flinch, he whispered. Neither did you, she smiled. And there, amid howling winds and deep snowdrifts, they drew strength from one another. Two souls once fractured, now welded together by storms, silence, and the shared will to survive. When the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, it painted the prairie in soft gold and silver. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and brittle with frost. Clara stepped out with a blanket around her shoulders, steam curling from her breath. The field stretched and quiet, broken only by the soft crunch of her boots on ice-covered grass. For the first time in weeks, the sky felt wide again, hopeful. Inside, Luke sat at the table with Levi and Em. The older children had started a new routine, helping with the chores before breakfast, learning how to fix broken tools, split kindling, and listen to the rhythm of the land. Clara returned with a fresh pail of water and handed it to Luke. That storm did more than rattle our roof. I think it knocked loose something in me, she said. Luke met her eyes. Me too. Later that week, a stranger rode up to the property. An older man in a worn black coat, silver hair blowing under a wide hat. He introduced himself as Reverend Jonah Kessler, from the edge of Dawson Ridge. I heard about the widow who married the man who nearly burned down trying to save her. He smiled gently. Luke chuckled from the porch. That's one version of it. The Reverend explained that he held Sunday services in a converted stable and invited them to attend. Clara hesitated. She hadn't been to a church since her parents gave her away. But Levi whispered, we could use some songs, and so they went. That Sunday, Luke and Clara walked in together. 7 children dressed in hand-sewn clothes followed close behind. Heads turned, murmurs passed, but no one said a word. They sat in the third row, hands joined, backs straight. When the hymn started, Clara didn't know the words, but she closed her eyes and hummed along. The moment felt sacred, whole. Outside the chapel, an elderly woman stopped Clara. You're her, aren't you? The one they said was left for dead. Clara braced for judgment, but the woman reached out and held her hand. You didn't die, you planted something. That evening, the family gathered around the hearth, and Clara pulled out a box she'd kept hidden. Inside were scraps of fabric she'd once stitched for a home that never came. She began sewing again, new patterns for new beginnings. You're making quilts? Luke asked. No, she smiled. Roots. And in the quiet stitching beneath the firelight, Clara was finally claiming a future not given, but chosen. Winter deepened its grip on the plains, but inside the small ranch house, warmth began to take root. Not just from the fire crackling in the hearth, but from the invisible threads slowly stitching each heart together. Luke walked the edge of the corral one morning, boots crunching in the snow, watching Levi coax a skittish mare with gentle words. The boy had been broken when they met, hollowed out by abandonment and bruised by silence. But here he was now, steady, patient, kind, just like a man should be. He's like you, Clara said quietly, stepping up beside Luke. Luke didn't answer right away. His eyes were misted, not from the cold, but from something older, deeper. He's like the man I'm still learning to become. In town, gossip about the ranch had changed. At first, people whispered in judgment about the widow who took in 7 children, about the man who bought a family. But slowly, the story morphed into something else. They became the miracle of Dawson Ridge. Merchants began offering discounts. Neighbors brought by sacks of grain and bolts of cloth. One man even dropped off a milking cow with a note that read, "For the woman who makes strangers into daughters." Clara cried when she read it. Not from sorrow, but from the strange joy of being seen without being pitied. By late January, the ranch had begun to thrive. Levi and Em took charge of the younger ones, teaching them how to collect eggs, mend clothes, and ride bareback in the fields. Clara taught them how to sing. And Luke taught them how to stay. One night, Clara caught him slipping a handmade wooden plaque above the hearth. It read, "The Foundlings Ranch." She tilted her head, confused. "We were all lost," he said, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "Now we're not." Outside, the wind howled through the trees. But inside that little house, there was something stronger than winter. There was belonging. And though none of them had set out looking for family, they had become one. February brought not just the thawing of snow, but a softening of walls within each heart that once braced for loss. Clara stood by the window one morning, watching the children trudge through the melting slush, laughing as they tried to catch snowflakes on their tongues. She didn't notice Luke approach from behind until his shadow joined hers. "They laugh like they've never known pain," she whispered. "Or maybe," Luke said, "they laugh because they finally know peace." His hand brushed against hers. Neither of them moved away. That same week, a letter arrived. Its envelope was weather-worn and smudged in ink, but Clara recognized the handwriting. It was from her sister. She hesitated before opening it. For years, her family had turned cold when she defied them, when she left home, when she dared to make choices for herself. She had braved the West, married a man who turned cruel, and then found herself alone in every sense. Until this place, until this family. The letter surprised her. Not because it asked for forgiveness. It didn't. But because it carried something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. "Tell me about them," her sister wrote. "Tell me about the man who made you smile again." Clara folded the letter slowly. She wasn't sure what she'd write back. But maybe this time she would write honestly. About the ranch, about the children, about Luke, about hope, rising like dawn over snow-covered fields. That evening, Luke found her on the porch. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, then looked up at him. "I don't think I ever understood what safe felt like, not until here." Luke said nothing, but his hand reached out and gently took hers, fingers lacing together without force, without demand. "You're safe here," he said, "and you're not alone anymore." Inside, Levi read to the little ones, his voice steady. Em braided Ruth's hair while Jonah tried to teach their dog tricks with biscuits. The home was alive, not in grand ways, but in the quiet ones that mattered. Outside, the sky turned a soft orange, and the sun dipped behind the pines. Inside, a family sat down for supper. Not a perfect family, not a family born of blood, but a chosen one. And sometimes that was even stronger. The wind carried a rare warmth through the valley as March crept in. With the snow finally melting and the ground softening beneath the hooves of cattle, it was the season of planting. But for Clara, something else had begun to take root, something far more delicate than wheat or beans. That morning she finally sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, replying to her sister's letter. "You asked about him," she began. The words flowed slowly, like a stream loosening after frost. She wrote of Luke's quiet strength, the way he listened without interruption, the patience in his hands as he taught Levi to mend fences or Em to harness a horse. She wrote of the nights filled with laughter, the dinners cooked side by side, the way the children had begun to sleep without nightmares. And finally she wrote of herself, not as someone broken or discarded, but someone reborn in the middle of nowhere. When she finished, she tucked the letter into an envelope and left it on the post shelf. But something had shifted. Clara realized she no longer feared being seen for who she was now. Later that week, Luke called for her from the barn. "There's someone coming up the road," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. She followed him out to the fence. A wagon approached, wheels crunching along the thawed earth. The sight made her breath catch. "That's my brother-in-law," she whispered. "David." The man pulled up, looking worn and wary. He tipped his hat but didn't smile. "I came because she told me you sounded different in your letter than you ever did back home," he said to Clara. "Said she had to see for herself if you were truly free." "Free?" Clara echoed. "Free from fear," David said. "Free from him." Luke stepped closer, not to protect, but to support. "She is," Luke said simply, "and she's home." The visit was awkward at first, but it didn't stay that way. David saw the way the children leaned into Clara's warmth, how the house held stories in every quiet moment. He noticed Luke, too, not as a threat, but as a presence that made space for Clara's voice to grow stronger. By the time he left, David looked changed. "Tell her I understand now," he said before driving off. "And I'll come back with her next time." That evening, as the stars broke through a sky scrubbed clean by spring winds, Luke brought Clara a small gift, a single daffodil he found blooming on the edge of the fence line. "A sign of new beginnings," he said. She smiled, tucking it into a glass by the window. "It's more than that," she replied. "It's proof that even what's buried under ice too long can still bloom." As spring matured and green crept back over the land, Clara found herself planning something she never imagined she'd host again, a gathering. It was Levi who suggested it first. "Mama," he'd said one evening, helping her wash dishes, "we could invite the neighbors, like a thank you, for everything." Luke overheard and nodded. "Folks would like that. They've seen you rebuild a life out here. Might be time to celebrate it." So they did. The barn was swept and strung with lanterns. The old Victrola Luke kept in the loft was brought down, polished, and set to spin soft fiddle tunes that echoed gently into the night. Long tables were arranged outside, each covered in checkered cloth and laden with pies, roasted meat, and hand-churned butter. As wagons rolled in and neighbors spilled out, laughter filled the yard. Some came curious, others cautious. But one by one they were disarmed by the simple joy radiating from Clara and her children. Even old Miss Derry, who once whispered judgments about Clara's past, brought jars of pickles and complimented Levi on his fencing. When the music swelled, Luke stood awkwardly near the corner of the barn, nursing a cider. Clara approached him with an outstretched hand. "Dance with me?" He hesitated, brow furrowed. "I haven't danced since before." "Me neither," she smiled gently. "Let's learn again, together." He took her hand. They moved slowly, uncertainly, under the swaying lanterns. It wasn't elegant. There were stumbles and soft apologies. But it was real. The children watched from the sidelines, wide-eyed and grinning. Neighbors began to clap along. Luke leaned in and whispered, "I never thought I'd feel like this again." "Me neither," Clara whispered back. "But here we are." That night, long after the last guests had departed and the lanterns had gone dim, Clara stood on the porch with Luke, arms wrapped around him against the chill. "It's not just the land that's growing again," she said. "It's us." He kissed the top of her head and looked out over the fields. "Let's keep planting then." By late summer, the golden haze of the fields shimmered under a sun that promised harvest, but the skies told another story. The storm came in fast, roaring like a herd through the valley. Luke had seen signs that morning: low pressure, restless animals, but even he underestimated its ferocity. The children were inside when the winds howled through the trees, whipping dust and leaves into angry spirals. Clara bolted the windows while Luke rushed to secure the barn. "Stay with them," he told Clara, eyes intense. "If I don't make it back before the worst hits, keep everyone in the root cellar." Clara grabbed his wrist. "Don't say that, just come back." He gave her a quick nod and vanished into the wall of rain. The thunder cracked with a violence that rattled their bones. Clara gathered Levi, Em, and the others and led them down into the root cellar with shaking hands. The storm pounded above, furious and relentless. For nearly an hour they sat in damp silence, listening. When the wind finally died, the silence that followed was even heavier. Clara emerged, heart lodged in her throat. She found Luke in the barn, half covered in debris, blood streaked along his temple, but breathing. He woke 2 days later, pain clouding his eyes but clarity in his voice. "You were the last thing I thought of." Clara wept, clutching his hand. "And you're the first thing I'll think of from now on." The ranch took damage, but it wasn't broken, and neither were they. Neighbors came to help. They rebuilt fences, patched roofs, and brought food. But more than tools or supplies, they brought stories. Stories of how Luke had once helped mend a neighbor's plow, how Clara had stitched blankets for widows, how their children offered eggs to a sick family down the road. It was then Clara realized they weren't outsiders anymore. They were part of the land, part of the people. One evening, Luke stood on the hill, arm in a sling, looking over the fields. "I bought this place for survival," he said. "But now I see it's more than that." Clara stepped beside him. "It's home." And in that soft twilight, scarred but whole, Luke took a small box from his pocket. "You gave me a family again," he said. "Let me give you my name." Clara didn't cry. She smiled and nodded. "I've already taken your heart. I'd be proud to carry your name too." The valley had bloomed anew by the time the wedding day arrived. It wasn't grand. It wasn't filled with lace or satin or polished silver. It was dust and wildflowers, hay bales for pews, and neighbors who brought fresh-baked bread and fiddle strings. Clara stood in a cream dress that she'd sewn herself, simple and beautiful, just like her. The children ran barefoot, their laughter carrying through the fields like music. Em had picked flowers for Clara's hair, and Levi, trying to hold in tears, kept straightening Luke's collar. Luke wore his cleanest shirt, boots freshly polished, and scars proudly on display. When Clara reached the front of the small gathering, he couldn't speak for a moment. He only looked at her as if she were sunrise after endless night. The preacher said a few words, but everyone knew the vows had already been lived, through wind, loss, healing, and hope. After the "I do," the crowd erupted in cheers. The fiddlers played, and someone popped open an old jug of cider. The children danced. Clara's smile never wavered. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, Clara and Luke walked out to the old wooden fence. No audience, no music, just wind rustling through tall grass in their joined hands. "I never thought this would be my story," Clara said softly. Luke looked out at the land he once tried to survive, and now thrived in. Me neither, but you wrote the best chapter. He kissed her forehead. Let's keep writing. Later that night, with the stars scattered bright overhead and the children asleep, Luke sat with Clara on the porch. You remember the day I found you? He asked. I remember thinking I wasn't worth being found. He squeezed her hand gently. You were wrong. Out in the darkness, the land stretched wide, quiet, untamed, and full of promise. And in the quiet hum of crickets and the glow of oil lamps behind them, two broken hearts beat steady in unison, stitched together by grit, grace, and the kind of love that didn't need words to last. Weeks passed. The rhythms of ranch life returned, but something in Clara had shifted. She no longer simply survived. She led. With Luke recovering from the storm injuries, Clara stepped up without hesitation. She rode the fence line with Levi, negotiated feed prices in town, and even taught him how to handle a skittish colt. The townsfolk, once wary, now greeted her with nods of respect. That woman's got more grit than most men I know, old Mr. Porter said at the mercantile. And a heart bigger than the whole valley, his wife added. Luke watched all this from the porch, healing slowly, pride shining in his eyes. I thought I was rescuing her, he told the doctor one evening. Turns out she saved me. Clara wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was helping others rebuild theirs too. She opened the doors of the ranch to two young sisters who'd fled hardship. She taught them to cook, sew, and ride. The ranch became a place of quiet redemption, a safe haven for those who had known too much pain. One night after dinner, Luke asked Clara a question that had been growing quietly in his chest. Do you ever think of the day you arrived here? She nodded slowly. Every day, because I walked onto this land as someone unwanted, and now I can't imagine being anywhere else. He reached across the table and took her hand. Then let's make this place more than ours. Let's make it theirs too, for every soul who needs a second chance. Together they drew up plans for expansion, not just barns and fields, but for cabins to house women in need, families starting over, and orphaned children who deserved more than silence and dust. The ranch would no longer be just a ranch. It would be a beginning. The wind rolled gently over the hills that spring, softer than it had been in years. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence line, and laughter echoed where silence once ruled. Clara stood at the edge of the property with Luke, watching as the first of the new cabins rose from the ground. Levi and Em ran nearby, racing toward the corral, their voices full of joy. They used to flinch at every noise, Luke murmured, arms folded across his chest. Now they chase the wind, Clara said with a quiet smile. The ranch became more than a sanctuary. It became a mission. They named it Widow's Valley Haven, not for grief, but for the strength born from surviving it. Word spread. Women who had been abandoned, widowed, mistreated, or simply lost found their way to the ranch. Each one arrived with a past too heavy to carry alone, and at Widow's Valley Haven, they were never asked to. Clara greeted every newcomer personally. You're not broken, she would say. You're just not done becoming. One woman arrived pregnant, left behind in a nearby town. Another had lost both parents and wandered for days. They were taken in without question, taught to ride, to cook, to build, to trust again. Luke, still healing in more ways than one, found strength in teaching the boys to work leather and handle horses. The scars on his body and heart didn't vanish, but they were no longer weights. They were reminders of what had been overcome. One evening, with the sky painted gold and fireflies drifting like memories, Luke brought Clara to the old tree at the back pasture, the one untouched since the day she'd been left beneath it. He knelt. You gave me back my life. Not just by surviving, Clara, but by believing I could be part of yours. Her breath caught as he slipped a simple band onto her finger. This ranch saved us both. Now let's build the rest together, as husband and wife. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, the woman once left to die beneath that very tree was now wrapped in arms that would never let her go. They didn't just write their story on this land. They built a legacy of love that would echo across the West.